electronic surveillance all day. It is, I will add this.
I was just going to tell you what, would you, either of you or both of you, just expand on, I'm not sure to what extent the general public is aware of the checks and balances with regard to FISA court, and when the executive branch is looking to do something and the judicial branch has a role to play. Would you just clarify that?
So the FBI has three essential components. There's a criminal component, a national security component, and a cyber component. In the criminal context, you've heard the concept of a Title III wiretap. That's a provision of the Omnibus Crime Bill in the criminal section of the U.S. Code, where you go before a magistrate as an agent that will swear out that the facts are true and accurate. It's a very, very high standard to tap somebody's phone line. It's considered a last resort from an investigative standpoint. The evidence is great, however, it's considered a very intrusive investigative technique. With the FISA court, that's essentially the Title III wiretaps in the national security context. And what the Second Circuit had found in Manhattan when they reviewed this case, specifically with the prison program and the FISA court Verizon order, was that the NSA was abusing their authority under the Patriot Act. Again, I felt like the USA Freedom Act struck the right chord. It was a bipartisan solution to preserve our national security and still preserve civil liberties.
Steve, doing that?
Right, and I think the main issue with the FISA court is making sure there's more transparency and there's greater opportunity to have a challenge with respect to what its rulings are. But let's get back to the fundamental point. The fundamental point is making sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent acts of terrorism on our homeland. And to do that, yes, electronic surveillance is part of the mix, but so too is making sure that we have good relations in these communities, that we can get information in a variety of different ways that will enable us to prevent an act of terror before it happens. And that, at the end of the day, is equally important and something that the next administration and frankly the next Congress needs to have foremost in its mind.
Thank you. The idea of a major job-creating infrastructure program seems popular with both parties. We need to build roads, repair or replace our bridges, modernize our airports and our power grids, all needed projects. Listening to the two presidential candidates this week, I felt like I was watching a Monopoly game. As one said, well, I'll spend $500 billion, or I'll double that, I'll spend $1 trillion. Can we have a discussion about, first of all, I assume you support the infrastructure program for many reasons. We have a discussion about how you pay for it, what size should it be, and how do you pay for it. And it's Mr. Fitzpatrick's turn to go first.
Infrastructure is one of the several areas, education, environment, I view as an investment, not an expense. We absolutely, positively need to invest in our critical infrastructure programs in this country. And it's not just roads and bridges, it goes to the electrical grid, it goes to underground pipes. We have a very, in many respects, an archaic infrastructure program in this country. And I think we need to fund it significantly because, again, it's an investment, not an expense. How do we do it? It all comes back to growing the economy. The problem that we are in right now from an economic standpoint is we can't afford to fund critical infrastructure programs, the environment, fund education, so that we can have the best educated youth in the world. And the reason we can't do it is because we have a terrible economic situation in this country. We have $19.5 trillion in national debt when the entire value of our economy, our entire GDP, is about $18.5 trillion. The interest component alone in last year's budget, I believe, was the 5th largest spending program in our country. And that's with historically low interest rates. If they tick up even a little bit, it's soon going to become the 3rd largest spending program in the country. That's just to service the debt that we have. We're hemorrhaging jobs, as I gave the example most recently with Ford Motor Company to Mexico. And you have regulations that are literally strangling businesses. Our overall economic climate is strangling businesses, and every single company that I visited in this district is telling the same exact thing. They cannot grow. They cannot hire new employees because of ever-increasing regulations, ever-increasing burdensome tax rates. And if we can create a pro-growth economic environment, then we can afford to fund things like infrastructure, which is critically important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It's a critical issue. It's one of the things I care very deeply about, and one of the things I've been involved in as a member of the state legislature. We were able to pass a major infrastructure funding, transportation infrastructure funding bill just a few years ago. I see my colleague Frank Ferry in the audience, he too voted for that. And it was important because when you look around now and see your roads and bridges being repaired, it's because of that. It was a Republican governor's bill, and equal numbers of us on both sides of the aisle came together and made it happen in Harrisburg. I think the FAST Act that was passed in Congress back in December was a good first start, but it's probably about a third of what needs to be done. We need to invest not just in our roads and bridges, but we need to invest in our waterways. You know, here in the 8th District, we have a navigable river. We're blessed with that. We need to invest in our IT infrastructure, and we need to invest ultimately in our energy grid infrastructure as well, that will help us invest in renewable energy sources too. Now, how do we do that? How do we fund all this, which was the central part of the question? Infrastructure bonds are one way to do it. Secretary Clinton has talked about creating an infrastructure bank, which will be solely geared toward raising the money and the capital for infrastructure. We need a president, and ultimately we need a Congress that will make this an absolute priority so that it happens. We can put people to work. We can create more jobs thereby and grow our economy, while at the same time making our roads and bridges safer, and ultimately making us more competitive in the world by having a first-class, world-class infrastructure, and it needs to be a priority.
Okay, we have another minute each. I'd like to just, Mr. Fitzpatrick, your view is predominantly we would fund these infrastructure programs through economic growth. As the economy grows, we have the funding to do it, and you're indicating, Steve, that we have, we float bonds and pay for it that way predominantly. Reactions to either one of those plans?
I just think it's interesting that I want to grow our way out, and Steve wants to add debt to solve the problem. You'll see that distinction a lot.
Let me tell you something. For decades in this country, we funded projects like this through bond issues. That was done by Republicans and Democrats. I'd love to grow our way out of things too, but that's not going to happen overnight. And the truth is that if we are going to have a stronger economy, that employs more people, that has wages rising, that brings more revenue into our government, we need to have a world-class infrastructure. So just saying it's going to happen through growing the economy is a non-answer. At the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're making this a priority. And it needs to happen on a bipartisan basis. And as I said, the good news is it happened on a bipartisan basis in Harrisburg. It can happen on a bipartisan basis in Washington, D.C. as well.
Thank you. Moving on to our next question. In case you haven't noticed, it's rare that the Democratic President of the United States and the Republican leadership of Congress agree on economic issues. However, they did agree on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. In fact, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan has explained that one of five jobs in America is based upon foreign trade. In this campaign, both Donald Trump and then later Hillary Clinton said they opposed the agreement. It's a problem for me. How can the highest ranking Democratic figure in the country and the highest ranking Republican figures in the country agree on the plan and say this is good for America, and two candidates for office from the two major parties say it's bad for America? To what extent, in your view, is the proper balance between free trade and protectionism? Do you support the Trans-Pacific Partnership as an example, but I don't want to get into the weeds on that as much as just the general concept of free trade versus protectionism, and specifically, how do these trade agreements impact your potential constituents in Bucks County? And we start with Mr. Santarsiero.
It's a critical issue, but I think it's a false question between the two, a false trade-off. It's not as if the alternative to these agreements is protectionism. We need to have trade agreements that are fair. And the fundamental problem with the TPP is it's not fair. It doesn't equal the playing field. It leaves American workers and American jobs at risk because you still have, in the other potential signatories to the agreement, systems where they don't have the same environmental protections we have in the United States. They don't have the same worker safety protections that we have fought for over 100 years here in the United States. And in fact, this agreement would ultimately subject those regulations here in the United States to potential litigation and challenge. So the issue isn't so much whether it's going to be protectionism or these trade agreements. The issue is whether we're going to have fair trade agreements that attempt to level the playing field so that American workers and American jobs can actually compete with these developing countries. That's the issue. That's what we ought to be fighting for. And I think we lose that if we think that it's just the old question about whether we should engage in protection. We're done with that. We need to make sure, for example, countries like China are being fair when it comes to how they treat American companies doing business there, and how they deal with trying to steal our intellectual property and espionage against American company interests. Those are things that we need to be dealing with in separate agreements. But ultimately, our trade policy has to be governed by the concept of fairness first and foremost.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
I am opposed to the TPP for one simple reason, because we cannot afford any longer to engage and enter into trade agreements that are bleeding jobs out of this country. And it crosses party lines. It was a bad idea with NAFTA under President Clinton. It was a bad idea with CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement under President Bush. And it's a problem now with TPP under President Obama. This trade agreement, if passed, would encapsulate 40% of the world's gross domestic product. 40%. And we have a very bad history in this country of entering into these trade agreements because, yet again, this year we are going to have a massive trade deficit. Every single one of these trade agreements we enter into are bleeding jobs out of our economy. I've seen it firsthand in my hometown of Levittown, perhaps more so than anywhere else in this district. The manufacturing base in our country is being decimated. The middle class is being crushed, and it is due part and parcel of these trade agreements. There are 12 member countries, approximately a dozen. I know it's in draft form at this moment. It seems like a very bad idea to me. For one reason, well, a lot of reasons, but the main reason is that what we've seen, what we've learned from history, is that when you enter into trade agreements with countries that have different, lower labor standards than we do, lower environmental standards than we do, countries that manipulate their currency, sometimes as a matter of public policy, it is time and time again a loser of a deal for this country. And it's time that we stand up against that. Trade is good, trade is necessary. We live in a global economy, we need trade. But it has to be fair and it has to benefit the United States of America.
You both have a follow-up, but let me interject before you do, because I respectfully have a concern with what both of you have said so far. I want to reiterate, the Democratic President of the United States and the Republican leadership of the Congress have said this is a good trade agreement. They supported it. What were they thinking? Is there are we pandering to populism? I'm speaking nationally, I'm not speaking just to the two of you. I understand the frustration among the American workers, jobs are leaving, and we need to blame it on someone and something. What were they thinking, the leaders of our country, who negotiated this deal and said, good deal, let's support it?
Well, listen, I think they had good intentions, but just because they support it doesn't mean being against it is pandering. I mean, at the end of the day, they've come up with an agreement that's not a good agreement. I understand what they were trying to do. They were trying to create this trade bloc that would also be a counterbalance to China. And that makes sense strategically. But the terms of the agreement make are really important as well. And just because that makes sense strategically, and just because, in this case, President Obama happens to be in favor of it, doesn't mean it's the right thing. And I would not be in favor, I would not vote for the reasons that I stated. It's not balanced, it's not fair, and ultimately, it will cause more American jobs to leave our shores at a time we can ill afford it.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Politicians always tell us these deals make sense, and they never have. We have a track record. Politicians, NAFTA was a bipartisan agreement, CAFTA was a bipartisan agreement, this apparently is a bipartisan agreement. I don't care who comes up with the idea, I'm a numbers guy, I'm a CPA. If I look at the numbers from what I've seen, I haven't delved in completely on this, but from what I've seen, I don't like it because it follows the same exact path, and if we don't learn from our past lessons, shame on us.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's discuss healthcare without the tired, old, predictable rhetoric. We know the problems and we know the benefits. Let me summarize them. We want to hear your positions moving forward. On the upside, we know that millions of additional Americans now have coverage because of the Affordable Care Act. On the downside, we also know that costs have risen well beyond expectations. How do we continue to expand coverage while at the same time bringing costs under control? Please be specific. We start with Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Well, I'll start by saying the way to expand coverage, and we all want everybody to have health insurance in this country. I believe health insurance is a right, not a privilege. We need to have everybody insured. The question is, how do we do it? What we've seen with the Affordable Care Act, 5 years after implementation, if you look at the three components to the Affordable Care Act, the individual mandate, the corporate mandate, and the state-run exchanges. We'll start with the individual mandate. What we've seen 5 years after implementation is that healthcare costs have gone up and not everybody's insured. In fact, in this district alone, just within the 8th Congressional District, 5 years after implementation, we have roughly 35,000 people in our district that still do not have health insurance. Mainly by choice, because the way the Affordable Care Act was set up, similar to the Social Security model, is that the younger, healthier population would subsidize the healthcare costs of the older population. But what we've seen, however well-intended it was, it collapsed under its own weight, because the younger population, the numbers have shown, are finding it more cost-effective to pay the fine than they are to insure themselves. And that's the problem. The employer mandate. I've spoken to so many businesses throughout this district, especially in the restaurant industry, which is interesting because a lot of them were told, as we all were, that the Affordable Care Act would only apply to organizations with more than 50 employees. What they did not know, many of them are filling out the ACA compliance spreadsheet for the first time now, is that you have to aggregate part-time hours. That is putting a lot of these restaurants in a Hobson's choice position where they now either have to lay off employees or pay a fine, which puts their going concern of their business in jeopardy. And the state-run exchanges, what we're seeing time and time again is that so many of these state-run exchanges are falling out because they can't afford it. To answer the question from the start, Mr. Pezza, the way we expand access is reducing costs. There's ways to reduce costs. If we allow out-of-state competition, competition brings excellence. We see it in every single industry. If you allow competition, costs will go down. Portability from one employer to the next. Medical liability reform, which most physicians will tell you is a significant cost driver in the defensive practice of medicine, and ordering tests that are unnecessary. There are steps we can take, but the model has to be to reduce costs. If you reduce costs, you expand access.
Thank you. Mr. Santarsiero?
So there are two fundamental problems. One of them is making sure that more people are insured, and that is an issue with respect to younger, healthier people. The other is the cost issue. And the cost issue takes two forms, as played out under the ACA. One of them is the cost of policies. The other is the cost of these high deductible policies that are out there. So that as a practical matter, many families who have insurance are paying very high out-of-pocket costs, and we need to do something about that. We have another issue, of course, with the high cost of prescription drugs. So what do we do? Well, there are a few things we should do, but didn't make it into the initial bill, but was supported by many members of Congress, is the public option. Even Speaker Ryan supports the public option. I think the public option would give yet another opportunity for competition with the big insurance companies to help bring the cost of those policies down, and ultimately to also bring down the cost of the deductibles. But we also need to look at, on the prescription drug side, doing things like letting Medicare negotiate for prescription drugs to help bring those costs down as well. We have, an aging population in this country, and it's not acceptable that the cost of prescription drugs seems skyrocketing, and many people are having to choose between their medication and being able to feed themselves. So I think those things are changes to the ACA that need to be made, and I think could have a real impact ultimately on both the scope of coverage and the cost of bringing those costs down.
Thank you. Follow-up? I'm going to ask a follow-up. A public option, what do you think?
I think more competition is good.
And malpractice reform, defensive medicine, what do you think?
it hasn't, you know, the fact of the matter is that malpractice reform is largely, that issue is a red herring in terms of the cost of healthcare. It has not been driving up healthcare costs. The fact of the matter is that those jury awards are not, in fact, making healthcare more expensive. I do think we have to be mindful of the fact that what is driving it, frankly, is the lack of competition right now. And the fact that, you know, we need to make sure that people have another option. That's why I think the public option is a critical piece of this.
I think defensive practice of medicine is a significant cost driver. Virtually every physician you meet will tell you that. And, you know, Steve, I know you're supported by the trial lawyers. I understand why you have your position. It is a cost driver. I don't think there's many people who look at the problem that don't think that adds to the cost of healthcare. When you are ordering tests as a physician to protect yourself from liability, and your medical malpractice insurance premiums are through the roof, that factors into the cost of healthcare, absolutely.
What I would say is that when you're injured, you want to make sure you have recourse. And at the end of the day, that's an important policy point as well. And if there were actually evidence that this issue was really driving and the main driver behind healthcare costs, we could have that discussion. But there isn't the evidence for that. That's just the reality.
Thank you. ISIS is an amorphous enemy. While centered in Syria and Iraq, it is also in Northern Africa and other parts of the Middle East. I'd like to think that voters are tired of bombastic, rhetorical nonsense and finger-pointing on this topic. They want to hear something of substance. Can you identify 3 specific steps you think we should take to combat ISIS, and do they include American forces on the ground? Start with Mr. Santarsiero.
They don't include American forces on the ground. What they do include are, 1, working with our Arab allies in particular to make sure that they have a coalition that can effectively defeat ISIS. And the good news is that that effort has been proceeding and it has been effective. We need to make sure that we're working with those allies and not offending them, as Donald Trump has in the course of his presidential campaign. Secondly, we need to make sure that we stay engaged. And one of the reasons why I think ISIS came into being in the first place was that we were less engaged than we should have been with the Iraqi government, which at that time, because it was dominated by Shia, was doing things in Iraq that was targeting the Sunni minority, which provided fertile recruiting ground for ISIS. ISIS is the problem today. There may well be and likely will be other radical groups to come in the future. We need to make sure that our engagement is constant and consistent so that that does not happen in the future. And the last thing we need to do is make sure that we're working with our allies and making our allies outside of the region, particularly our NATO allies, to make sure that we're doing everything we can to combat this threat, not just in the Middle East, but making sure that it doesn't become terrorism that gets exported first to Europe and then to the United States. And that means, among other things, having the absolute best screening process for people coming into this country and making sure, frankly, that the Europeans do the same things, so that there's not a conduit there to the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Well, I know the problem well because I actually was in Iraq myself, and I interrogated the precursor entity to ISIS. It was referred to as ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq. This was before their migration into Syria. The problem started, quite frankly, by the initial invasion into Iraq, which I think was not the best decision, followed by an even worse decision to precipitously withdraw without a status of forces agreement. So when you create a vacuum like that, in a very dangerous part of the world where very dangerous people live, it should come as no surprise that ISIS has risen up. What can we do to solve the problem? Well, this was a fight we were engaged in, and I was engaged in for a very long time, up until earlier this year. And the first and foremost measure we can take is cutting off the illicit international money laundering, which is funding not just ISIS, but virtually every terror group on this planet. And there are ways to do it. We know where the money flows through. We know that the culpable countries, those countries do business with the United States. And we can use our leverage as a United States government to force these countries to work with the international law enforcement community, which I was a part of, in investigating international money laundering, to cut down on illicit money laundering that's funding, in this case, to Mr. Pez's question, ISIS. Because just like any other organization, just like any company, just like any nonprofit, terror groups are no different. If you cut their funding off, you cut the head off of the snake. If they can't purchase the tools they need to perpetuate their evil schemes, they dry up. Second is working with our Arab allies, in particular the Kurds, who have been very, very effective in helping us fight back. And third is effective law enforcement, and that's something that has really taken a hit in recent years. We need to support the national security community, Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, ICE, to fight these terrorists here and abroad, as well as our military.
Thank you. I'm hearing a lot of agreement between the two of you. Is there an area where you more strongly disagree?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we'll see in the course of this debate further, but there are a lot of things, of course, we haven't discussed.
I meant specifically about.
Well, I don't know, but what I'll tell you is this. At the end of the day, the other thing we need to be doing right here in the United States that will help make our community safer is passing a reasonable gun safety legislation. Because that's part of the equation too. It's not going to solve it all, but there's no reason why we should not have universal background checks and a no-fly, no-buy bill. Now, the Republican Congress has not even entertained that legislation. We need a Congress that will bring those bills up for consideration. Will they solve our problems? No. But there are reasonable steps that we should take in our federal government.
Patrick,
Do you want to comment on?
on your level of agreement between the two of you, or perhaps a response to the gun issue?
I agree. We need to take reasonable measures to end gun violence for sure. I mean, the fight of terrorism, the fight against terrorism has a foreign policy component, a counter-terrorism component, a counterintelligence component, a cybersecurity component, a border security component, and a gun safety component. But it's not just guns, it's all weapons that terrorists use. Guns certainly are on the list. And we absolutely need to take measures to make sure that guns stay out of the hands of dangerous people, including background checks. I've been very clear on that.
So, working with our allies, our Muslim allies, cultivating Muslim allies, keeping our eye on the ball and being engaged, working with our NATO allies, stopping the flow of illicit money that funds these guys, and giving law enforcement the tools it needs to, seems to be what we're saying. So why don't we send a letter to Washington today and clear this up? Next question. I have stood on this stage for 12 years and asked congressional candidates their view on the millions of undocumented immigrants in America. I've heard tough talk about sending them all back and compassionate talk about creating a path to citizenship. But little of substance has changed in that time. Can today be the day that we hear a proposal that is pragmatic, workable, and still respects the rule of law? And we start with Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Well, the first part of any immigration problem is stopping the illegal flow of immigration, which is securing our border. It's important for a number of reasons. It's no longer just drugs and guns coming across the border. It's now people that want to do us harm. We saw this all too frequently in my days in the FBI. So once you secure the border, the next question is how to deal with the undocumented immigrants that are in this country. And I believe they need to be dealt with humanely and are becoming of American values. Immigration is not a bad thing, it is a good thing. We are a nation of immigrants. I'm the grandson of Irish immigrants. I think most of us can trace our lineage back to somewhere other than this country, not going too far back. And that's a good thing. But the guiding principle must be that we must not reward bad behavior ahead of rewarding good behavior. People that have done things the right way, have come in through the front door, have waited their time, and have done things the right way need to be given priority status. That being said, I think mass deportation is a silly idea. It shouldn't even be discussed. It's not workable. It's not humane. We can deal with them in a humane manner that makes sense for our economy and is becoming of American principles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. This is an important issue and one I feel very strongly about as the descendant of immigrants from both Italy and Ireland. And I can tell you that, yes, we absolutely have to secure our borders. But the idea that we're going to deport 12 million people is one, not workable, and two, not humane and ripping families apart. I think what we have to do is our policy, and the good news is, by the way, that we came very close just a couple of years ago to a bipartisan bill to resolve this issue in Congress, and it fell apart at the last minute. And I believe the next Congress will actually have a great opportunity to get it done. What we need to do is make sure that those people who are here illegally now, who play by the rules, who pay their taxes, who do all the things that citizens need to do as citizens of this country, have the opportunity to legal status and ultimately citizenship. And that those who do not, and those who commit crimes, should be deported. But I think that should be the main basis for an immigration reform that we will pass in the United States that will keep families together and ultimately will make our economy stronger too, because we're going to bring these folks out of the shadows into the economy, paying their fair share of taxes, being productive members of our country. And listen, one of the greatest things about the United States, one of the things that sets us apart from all other countries, is our rich history of immigration and the fact that from many we have become one. And it makes our culture so much diverse, and it makes us so much stronger as a people. That's something we should embrace.
Would you like to extend your comments? Anything else? Thank you, gentlemen. A person who is 21 years old today would have been in middle school when the Great Recession hit in 2008. Since then, they have known nothing but a sluggish economic growth, uninterrupted war, gridlock in Congress, and a painful absence of civility from many public officials, present company excluded. It is not surprising if they are turned off by the two-party system. What can you say to them today about you, your candidacy, or your political party to perhaps renew their faith? We start with Mr. Santarsiero.
Like I said at the outset of this debate, when I was teaching at Ben Salem High School, I did see the promise of that next generation. And I know that they are fundamentally optimistic, even though they're concerned about the challenges they face. What I would say as a former history teacher, and I used to say to them all the time, is we have faced challenges before in this nation's history. And we've overcome them. When we come together to make that happen, when we divide ourselves into red and blue, into different groups that are either for or against it, it makes it nearly impossible to get those things done. And that, frankly, is the thing that is so disturbing about this year's election at the presidential level with Donald Trump. Because his campaign has been all about division. It's been all about setting people against each other, and not about bringing everybody together. If we're going to solve these problems, we need to do it together. And we can solve the problems. We can invest in education. We can invest in infrastructure. We can make our country safer. We can reform government, which is something else we absolutely need to do. Whether it's campaign finance and taking the money out of the system, whether it's gerrymandering reform so that politicians don't choose their voters, voters get to choose their elected officials. Whether it's overturning the Citizens United case, which is something that I have fought for as a state legislator, and I'll make a priority as a member of Congress as well. All these things we can do. And what I would say to them is have faith. Look at history. Look at past generations. But it's incumbent upon us who are on the stage now to make sure we are doing the things that when we pass off that baton to the next generation, we're putting them in the greatest possible position to succeed.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Sounds like Steve read a lot of that off my website. So we'll talk about, to the younger generation, my words to you, don't lose faith. We cannot allow you to lose faith because you are the future of our country. You're all we have right now. And this election is about you. As far as fixing the system, watching that presidential debate, I think, tells us all we need to know about the brokenness in our government right now. Watching the gridlock that exists in Congress tells you all you need to know about the brokenness of our system right now. And what we've seen, we have this great divide in Congress, the likes of which we have never seen before. Part of the problem is decade after decade of gerrymandering, following the 10-year census, where you have politicians drawing the district lines, and self-preservation is a very strong human instinct. And these elected officials, by and large, will draw the lines that benefit themselves and their incumbency. And what you have, decade after decade of this politically motivated line drawing, is that you have a situation where we have 435 seats in this country, congressional districts. There's only about 15 to 20 remaining that are legitimate swing districts. We're lucky enough to live in one right here, thanks in large part to my brother Mike, who wanted to keep Bucks County whole. More districts need to be like this, where they are split equally between parties, because when you have that, you don't get what you have in these other districts, where you have 65, 70% of one party registration or another in these congressional districts. And when you have that, these representatives, their main election is in the primary, it's not the general. And they legislate accordingly. They legislate to their base. And as a result, you have this growing capitalist divide in Congress. That's what needs to end as far as fixing the gridlock in Washington. I didn't have time to address the others, but I see my right up here, so.
Well, let's be clear. The 8th district was gerrymandered to some extent after the last redistricting. I voted against those maps, and I can tell you those of us who were opposed to them were shut down from really raising objections. Northeast Philadelphia was taken away, which was more democratic, and the northern part of Montgomery County was added, which is a more Republican area. Now, the fact of the matter is, it's still a pretty balanced district, but make no mistake, there was that attempt here too. We need to have nonpartisan commissions that draw these maps, not elected officials as we do here in Pennsylvania. And there need to be national rules that govern that throughout the United States. It is a serious problem, but so too is campaign finance. And Citizens United, that has caused all this dark money to enter into these races, has been a disaster for our democracy. That case needs to be overturned, and we need to have campaign finance reforms that take the money out of politics once and for all.
Thank you. I hope someday in the future, near future, we can have a symposium devoted solely to congressional reapportionment and gerrymandering. We'll have to figure out a way to keep the audience awake while we do it, but it's an extremely important topic that shapes our Congress. And we are fortunate to live in a district that is balanced and is competitive. I want to say before I give these gentlemen an opportunity for their final questions, or their final statements rather, that I think we're very fortunate in Bucks County to have two outstanding individuals on this stage today, conducting themselves in a professional manner, sharing issues, sharing their information, and being informed, and that it's refreshing to see that, and I wish you both the best of luck. And I'm going to ask you, before your final comments, I'm going to ask you the question I always close our debates with, and that is, if elected, will you return to this campus in 2018 for another debate? Mr. Fitzpatrick, you're first.
Only if you're the moderator, Bill. I get the same answer every time.
Santarsiero?
I will absolutely be here, and I too would like you to be the moderator, and I hope that those of you who are in the audience today would be here as well, because we ought to have more of these debates. And one of my real disappointments in this campaign so far is that we've had so few debates. It's important for people to be able to hear where we stand on the issues. And today, frankly, there are still a number of issues we haven't talked about. You know, we haven't really talked about this. We haven't really talked about the issue of choice. We haven't really talked about what we are going to do more by way of political reform. It's absolutely critical. It's something we should be dealing with here in the United States. It's a critical issue. So I think this has been a great debate, but I also think that those are the things that the public need to hear about, and we really ought to be having more.
Also, save yourself the trouble of telling the moderator what he did not bring up today. He knows. Okay? We did not discuss Russia, cyber warfare, military spending, veterans, energy, job retraining, education. We'll do that after this. Take a quick break, come back, and we'll stay here for a couple of hours to do that. Our closing statements, 1 minute, starting with Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you again, Steve, for participating. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the young kids for watching. Just remember what I said at the outset, stay involved, and whatever your voice is, let that voice be heard. We have, and I really wish this debate could go on much longer. Mr. Pez is a fabulous moderator, universally respected, and there are so many issues and problems facing our world today. And we all know what they are in this room. And my pitch to you would be that when we're selecting the next representative in this district, to me, there's two critical issues. Number one is who has the experience in the critical areas that are facing our country: economic growth and national security. I spoke at the outset, my experience as a CPA and financial services background is very, very helpful in growing our economy. And second, working in the FBI, both nationally here from coast to coast and globally around the world, working counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and cybersecurity is critically important. Second is that I believe this to my core, that the only way we fix our problems in this country is from people coming outside of the system. Our problems cannot and will not be fixed by career partisan politicians who represent more gridlock and a perpetuation of the broken status quo. We can fix the problems we have from an economic and national security standpoint, but we're running out of time. And we need to fix them now.
Thank you. Mr. Santarsiero?
My dad, my 90-year-old dad, always used to say, talk is cheap. You can say just about anything when you're a candidate, but what matters is what you've done. There's one candidate on this stage who has brought jobs into this district. One candidate on this stage who has protected thousands of jobs for our people. One candidate on this stage who has protected a woman's right to choose. One candidate on the stage who has fought for reasonable gun safety legislation. One candidate on the stage who time and again has fought for our community, whether it's flooding, power outages, or even the problem with halfway houses right here in Bristol Township. That's me. Now, we can talk about career politicians and the like, who's an outsider and who's not an outsider. You know, the fact is, my opponent is as much of an insider as anybody else. He wouldn't be running in this race if he were not. His name were not Ryan Fitzpatrick, say it was Ryan Wilson, he'd still be living in a beach house in California. The fact of the matter is that we can talk about these labels and we can talk about slogans, but at the end of the day, what matters is what we have done and what our record is of fighting for people in this district. I have that record of accomplishment. I will continue it as a member of Congress, and I ask for your support. Thank you.
As was agreed upon in the rules prior to the debate, if in the closing statements there is reference to the other candidate may have more time. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Yeah, that's unfortunate, Steve, and I will say that there's only one candidate on the stage who's put their life on the line for their country, and it's not you. And I will also say, that it is highly insulting to criticize someone who leaves their hometown to serve their country, the only time they're out of their hometown, to serve their country in a national security role, to protect everyone in this room, to protect you, Steve, to protect you and your family. To criticize me for that is really unfortunate.
Make no mistake, I'm not criticizing you for service. What I'm criticizing you for is being part of the system that, and I can tell you, I've talked to many people in this community who feel that it's rigged, that there's one set of rules for most people and a different set of rules for people who are connected. And Brian, the reality is you wouldn't be running for this seat if your brother were not for Congressman. You would not have been given the Republican nomination. That's just the reality. And it has nothing to do with your service. We can all applaud your service, as I do. But at the end of the day, it's about who's been working in this community for year after year after year. Who's been living here, and who knows what people are feeling and the problems that they face. And I think when people go into the voting booth on November 8th, they have to think about who has been doing that, who has been working for them, and who has that record.
We're going to give another 30 seconds each. We made it through Thanksgiving dinner right up till dessert, and now we have this. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
If you want to know the biggest difference between the two candidates on the stage right now, one is a career politician, and the other spent his career arresting politicians. That is a big difference. And number two, you know, Steve, I've seen the rhetoric throughout this campaign. I wish you'd stick to the issues. I wish you'd stay away from all the other stuff. Don't attack me for my service. I'm from this area. I was born and raised in this area. Not only have I lived here longer than you, Steve, I've lived here literally twice as long as you. I'm not raising residents in charge of you. I left my hometown to serve my country that I love, to serve everybody in this room.
I think if there's a mark of who is a career politician or who is a politician, it's somebody who comes in to a district like this to run, and then who at the 11th hour jettisons his presidential candidate to save his own political skin. Those comments from Donald Trump that came out last Friday were offensive, but so too was attacking a federal judge because of his ancestry. So too was attacking a Gold Star family. So too was saying that he was okay with nuclear proliferation. It's awfully convenient now, when we're getting close to the election, to say, okay, now I'm not with him anymore. But this election is about character too, it's about consistency, and I think voters need to remember that.
Time has expired. I want to let the audience know that the press will be meeting with the candidates down the hall privately, and I'm sure they may want to pursue this discussion a little further. Thank you very much for your attendance. Please vote.